Imagine a government that makes Pablo Escobar look like a corner dealer. Between 1839 and 1949, the British Empire generated over $2.3 trillion in today's money from a single product. Not gold, not oil, not even tea. Opium, raw, concentrated opium that turned 40 million Chinese people into addicts and toppled the world's oldest continuous civilization. But what nobody talks about is who actually ran this operation. You see those famous opium barons, the Sassoons, the Jardines, the Mathesons. They were just the visible faces. Behind them sat the British Crown itself, collecting taxes on every grain of poison sold, providing military protection for drug shipments, and waging two separate wars to keep the heroin flowing. This wasn't some rogue colonial adventure. This was deliberate economic warfare orchestrated from Buckingham Palace, executed by the Royal Navy, and celebrated in Parliament. When China tried to stop the drugs, Britain sent 40,000 soldiers armed with steam-powered warships to force them back open. When Chinese officials burned $300 million worth of opium in protest, the British response was swift. Bomb their cities, occupy their ports, and make them pay for the drugs they destroyed. The profits were staggering. British opium revenues in 1900 alone exceeded the entire GDP of France. The Sassoon family, essentially Britain's drug distribution network in Asia, accumulated wealth that made them richer than Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Warren Buffett combined. Their Shanghai mansion employed 500 servants. Their private fleet included 47 steamships. They owned entire city blocks in Bombay, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. Yet somehow this remains the untold story of how modern capitalism was born. Every major British bank, every shipping company, every trading house, they all have opium money in their foundation. HSBC was literally created to launder drug profits. Jardine Matheson still operates today as one of Asia's largest conglomerates. China remembers. Every Chinese schoolchild learns about the century of humiliation. Every major Chinese leader since Mao has referenced the opium trauma in speeches about Western interference. When China banned fentanyl exports in 2019, they explicitly mentioned Britain's historical drug forcing as justification. This is the story of how a small island nation built history's most profitable criminal enterprise, dressed it up as free trade, and convinced the world they were civilizing backward peoples. This is the story of the British Crown's opium empire, the blueprint every modern drug cartel still follows today. By 1900, the British Empire controlled the world's largest drug trafficking network, but they didn't start as dealers. They started as tea addicts. Picture London in 1750. Every afternoon at 4 p.m. sharp, wealthy British families gathered for their most sacred ritual. Not prayer, not politics. Tea time. China controlled the world's only supply of quality tea leaves, and British demand was absolutely insatiable. Upper-class English society consumed tea like Americans consume coffee today, multiple times daily, socially essential, completely addictive. Here's what made this tragic. Britain had nothing China wanted in return. Chinese civilization had existed for 4,000 years. They had silk when Britain still wore animal skins. They had porcelain when Britain ate from wooden bowls. They had gunpowder when Britain fought with swords. The Chinese emperor looked at British goods, wool, manufactured items, even British technology, and essentially said thanks but no thanks. This created what economists call a balance of payments crisis. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China at an unprecedented rate. Every chest of tea cost British merchants pure Spanish silver, which was flowing out of London's treasuries and into Chinese vaults. Between 1760 and 1780, Britain sent over 38 million silver dollars to China. That's roughly 2.8 billion in modern currency flowing in one direction, from London banks straight into Chinese hands. Robert Clive, the British military officer who later conquered Bengal, wrote in 1759, "We are becoming tributary vassals to Chinese merchants. Our silver reserves cannot sustain this hemorrhage indefinitely." The directors of the East India Company calculated that at current consumption rates, Britain would face bankruptcy within 2 decades. Tea addiction was literally destroying the British economy. But then someone in a Calcutta trading house made a dark discovery. In the conquered Bengal region of India, local farmers grew something that Chinese people wanted even more than the Chinese wanted British goods: opium poppies, dense, sticky, pure opium that could create physical addiction after just 3 uses. What most people don't realize is that opium wasn't originally a British product. Indian farmers had grown poppy flowers for centuries, using the raw opium for local medicinal purposes. The British simply weaponized an existing crop, turned subsistence farming into industrial drug production, and created history's first narco-state. The transformation was systematic and brutal. The East India Company declared opium a company monopoly, meaning Indian farmers could only sell to British buyers at British fixed prices. Any farmer caught selling to non-British traders faced imprisonment or execution. Within 5 years, the company controlled 2.3 million acres of opium cultivation across Bengal, Bihar, and the United Provinces. By 1820, British-controlled opium production in India generated more revenue than cotton, rice, and indigo combined. The East India Company's opium department employed 2,400 full-time officials, operated 30 processing factories, and maintained a private army of 1,600 soldiers, specifically to protect poppy fields from theft. This wasn't casual drug dealing. This was industrial-scale narcotics manufacturing run by the British government. The genius, if you can call it that, was in the distribution network. British officials couldn't be seen directly selling drugs to China because that would violate international law and their own public image. Instead, they created what modern lawyers would recognize as a sophisticated criminal conspiracy. Here's how it worked. The East India Company grew the opium in India using enslaved Bengali farmers. Private British merchants, families like Jardine, Matheson, and Sassoon, bought the opium at government auctions in Calcutta. These merchants then shipped the drugs to Canton using British protected vessels. Chinese dealers distributed the opium inland, using networks the British merchants established. When local Chinese authorities tried to interfere, British warships happened to be nearby to protect legitimate commerce. Every level generated massive profits, and every level had plausible deniability. The East India Company claimed they only grew agriculture. The private merchants claimed they only bought and transported goods. The British Navy claimed they only protected British citizens engaged in legal trade. The Chinese dealers claimed they were just meeting market demand. But behind this carefully constructed fiction sat the British Crown, collecting taxes at every stage, providing military support when needed, and counting drug profits as legitimate imperial revenue. The scale became staggering. By 1838, British-controlled opium shipments to China totaled 40,000 chests annually. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of pure opium, enough to supply 2,000 addicts for a month. Conservative estimates suggest British opium created between 12 and 15 million Chinese addicts during the peak years of 1820-1850. To put that in perspective, modern Mexico's entire drug cartel system generates roughly $30 billion annually. The British opium network generated $47 billion per year in modern currency, operated with full government backing, and faced no meaningful law enforcement opposition because they were the law enforcement. The Chinese Emperor Daoguang finally understood what was happening to his people around 1834. Entire Chinese provinces were becoming economically dependent on opium cultivation rather than food production. Chinese silver was flowing to British banks at rates that threatened the imperial treasury. Most devastating of all, Chinese society itself was crumbling as opium addiction spread from port cities into rural villages. His response was decisive and moral: completely ban opium imports, arrest dealers, and destroy existing supplies. Any rational government would do exactly the same thing if foreign powers were systematically addicting their population to heroin. Britain's response revealed the true nature of their free trade philosophy. They declared war. Not economic sanctions, not diplomatic protests. Actual military war complete with naval bombardments, occupation forces, and territorial conquest. Britain sent 16 warships, 4,000 Marines, and 37,000 sepoy soldiers to force China to accept British drug imports. The message was clear: accept our drugs or we'll destroy your cities until you do. This wasn't about trade rights or diplomatic disagreements. This was about preserving the most profitable criminal enterprise in human history, backed by the world's most powerful navy, justified by economic theories that would make Pablo Escobar proud. But to understand how this system actually worked and why it succeeded for over a century, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to the moment when British merchants first realized they could solve their tea addiction by creating China's opium addiction. Back to the moment when legitimate trade became systematic drug dealing, sanctioned by the British Crown. Chapter 1. Tea Wars. The British Empire's transformation into history's largest drug cartel began with a simple accounting problem in London's financial district, July 15, 1757. Robert Clive had just won the Battle of Plassey, effectively conquering Bengal for the East India Company. In the celebration halls of Leadenhall Street, the company's London headquarters, directors were calculating their new Indian revenues when Chief Accountant William Makepeace made a disturbing discovery. Despite controlling vast territories in India, despite collecting taxes from 20 million Bengali subjects, despite extracting tribute from defeated Indian princes, the company was hemorrhaging money. The annual reports showed a staggering 2.3 million deficit. Virtually every penny of Indian revenue was being spent on a single Chinese product: tea. "Gentlemen," Makepeace announced to the assembled directors, "we are the richest beggars in world history. We rule kingdoms, yet we cannot afford our afternoon refreshment." The numbers were genuinely shocking. British tea consumption had increased 2,900% in just 40 years. London alone imported £5 million of tea annually, enough to brew 800 million cups. Every social interaction, every business meeting, every family gathering revolved around tea service. Refusing tea was considered social suicide among the British upper classes. But China absolutely refused to accept British payment in anything except pure silver. Chinese merchants looked at British manufactured goods, fine wool textiles, precision timepieces, even advanced scientific instruments, and dismissed them as inferior craftsmanship. "Why would we want your primitive trinkets?" Chinese Trade Commissioner Lin Zexu wrote in 1759, "when our artisans produce superior versions of everything you offer." This wasn't Chinese arrogance. This was Chinese reality. China in 1760 was arguably the world's most advanced civilization. They had invented paper money when Britain still used barter systems. They had developed printing presses 600 years before Gutenberg. They had created gunpowder, magnetic compasses, and mechanical clocks centuries before Europe discovered the technologies. From a Chinese perspective, Britain was a backward island kingdom whose only valuable possession was Spanish silver stolen from South American mines. The silver drain was literally unsustainable. Between 1760 and 1780, the East India Company shipped $38.7 million silver dollars to Chinese ports. British merchants were melting down English coins, importing Spanish reals from Caribbean colonies, even purchasing silver from Dutch traders at premium prices, all to feed London's tea addiction. William Pitt the Elder, serving as Prime Minister, commissioned a secret study on British financial vulnerability. The report, completed in 1764, contained a terrifying conclusion. At current consumption rates, British silver reserves will be completely exhausted within 18 years. Our American colonies cannot supply adequate silver. Spanish sources remain unreliable. Unless alternative payment methods are developed, Britain faces potential economic collapse. This was the moment that changed everything. Company directors needed a product that Chinese people wanted more than they wanted British silver, something that could reverse the flow of wealth from London to Canton, something that could turn Britain from economic tributary into economic master. The solution came from an unexpected source: Dr. William Roxburgh, a Scottish botanist stationed in Bengal. Roxburgh had been cataloguing Indian plant species when he noticed something interesting about local poppy cultivation. Bengali farmers grew opium poppies for traditional medicinal use, but they processed the raw opium very inefficiently. Most of the psychoactive compounds were lost during harvest and preparation. Local opium was weak, inconsistent, and minimally addictive, but Roxburgh had studied chemistry at Edinburgh University. He understood that with proper cultivation techniques, controlled processing methods, and chemical refinement, Bengali poppy fields could produce opium of unprecedented purity and potency, opium that would create immediate physical addiction, opium that Chinese users would pay any price to obtain. His letter to company headquarters dated March 12, 1773 read, "Gentlemen, I believe we have discovered nature's solution to our Chinese problem. With modest investment in agricultural improvement and processing facilities, Bengal can produce opium superior to anything currently available in Chinese markets. Conservative estimates suggest potential revenues of $400,000 annually." The company response was immediate and systematic. They established the Opium Department as a separate administrative division with its own budget, personnel, and operational authority. Dr. Roxburgh received a promotion to Superintendent of Botanical Operations, with a salary increase of 300%. Most importantly, they allocated $50,000 for agricultural expansion and processing facility construction. The transformation happened with stunning efficiency. Company officials identified the most suitable soil conditions across Bengal, Bihar, and the United Provinces. They provided Bengali farmers with improved poppy seeds, cultivation tools, and detailed growing instructions. They constructed processing factories equipped with imported copper vats, chemical purification systems, and quality control laboratories. Within 3 years, British-controlled opium production increased 480%. By 1778, Bengal alone produced 3,200 chests of refined opium annually. Each chest contained 140 pounds of pure, chemically consistent opium, roughly 10 times more potent than traditional Chinese varieties. The distribution strategy was equally sophisticated. Company officials couldn't be seen directly selling opium to Chinese customers because that would violate both British law and Chinese import regulations. Instead, they created what modern legal scholars would recognize as an elaborate criminal conspiracy designed to provide plausible deniability at every level. Here's how the system worked. The East India Company conducted public auctions of opium in Calcutta, selling exclusively to pre-approved British merchants. These merchants, families like Jardine Matheson and eventually the Sassoons, purchased opium using credit provided by British banks. The merchants then transported opium to Canton using British-flagged ships protected by Royal Navy patrols. Once in Chinese waters, the opium was transferred to smaller vessels operated by Chinese smugglers who distributed the drugs throughout China's interior. Every step was technically legal. The company claimed they only produced agricultural products. The merchants claimed they only engaged in legitimate international trade. The Navy claimed they only protected British commercial interests. The Chinese smugglers claimed they were independent contractors, making their own business decisions. But everyone involved understood the real purpose, systematically addicting the Chinese population to British-controlled drugs in order to reverse the flow of silver from London to Canton. The initial results exceeded their wildest projections. Chinese demand for British opium was absolutely insatiable. Unlike traditional Chinese opium, which required extensive preparation and produced mild effects, British opium was ready for immediate consumption and created powerful, instantaneous highs, followed by crushing physical withdrawal. Chinese users quickly discovered they needed increasingly larger doses to achieve the same effects. What started as recreational experimentation became physiological necessity within weeks. Users who tried to quit experienced violent physical symptoms, vomiting, convulsions, hallucinations, and crippling pain that could only be relieved by more opium. By 1785, British opium sales to China generated $600,000 annually, more than enough to pay for all British tea imports, with substantial profits remaining. The silver drain had not just stopped, it had completely reversed. Chinese silver was now flowing into British accounts at unprecedented rates. Company Director Warren Hastings wrote in his confidential report to Parliament, "We have achieved something unprecedented in commercial history. We have transformed our greatest economic weakness into our most productive asset. Chinese addiction to our opium generates more reliable revenue than our Indian tax collection, our Caribbean sugar plantations, and our North American fur trade combined. But this was only the beginning. The company had discovered something more valuable than a single profitable trade route. They had discovered they could use systematic drug addiction as a tool of economic warfare. They could create dependencies that would allow them to dictate terms to even the most powerful foreign governments. The Chinese emperor was about to learn what happens when an ancient civilization encounters the world's first narco-state, and the British were about to discover that running a drug empire requires military force, systematic corruption, and a willingness to wage war against any government that attempts to protect its people from systematic poisoning. The tea wars were ending. The Opium Wars were about to begin. Chapter 2. Poppy Fields. The transformation of Bengal into history's largest opium plantation required systematic brutality disguised as agricultural improvement. Company records from 1780 reveal the true scale of British agricultural colonization. Across 2.3 million acres of Bengali farmland, the East India Company imposed what they euphemistically called cultivation guidelines. In reality, these were mandatory orders backed by military force. Grow opium poppies according to British specifications, sell exclusively to company buyers at company fixed prices, or face imprisonment, land seizure, and potential execution. Mohan Das, a Bengali farmer from Patna district, left one of the few surviving personal accounts of this agricultural transformation. His diary, discovered in 1890 and translated by British colonial officials, provides a horrifying glimpse into how the company converted subsistence agriculture into industrial drug production. January 1781. The company Sahib came to our village today with 20 sepoy soldiers. He carried papers he claimed gave him authority over our land use. He pointed to our rice fields and declared them suitable for alternative cultivation. When our village headman asked about feeding our families, the Sahib replied, "The company will provide rice rations in exchange for poppy cooperation." This wasn't negotiation. This was agricultural conscription, enforced at gunpoint. The company's opium system required absolute control over every stage of production. They couldn't risk farmers selling poppies to competing buyers, growing food crops instead of drugs, or producing inconsistent opium quality. So they created what modern economists would recognize as a monopsony, a market with only one buyer, backed by colonial military power. Regional company officials implemented the system with ruthless efficiency. They surveyed all agricultural land in their territories, identifying soil conditions suitable for poppy cultivation. They calculated optimal planting densities, harvest schedules, and processing techniques. Most importantly, they established quotas for every village, every farm, and every individual farmer. Bengali farmers discovered they had no choice in crop selection. Company officials visited villages during planting season, carrying pre-written contracts in English and Bengali. The contracts specified exactly how many acres each farmer must dedicate to poppy cultivation, which specific poppy varieties they must grow, when they must plant and harvest, and where they must deliver their raw opium. Farmers who signed the contracts received advance payments of roughly 30 rupees per acre, barely enough to purchase seeds and basic tools. Farmers who refused to sign faced immediate consequences: land seizure under colonial improvement laws, arrest for interfering with company commerce, or simply having their existing crops destroyed by sepoy soldiers. Dr. Francis Buchanan, a company medical officer who toured Bengali villages in 1783, wrote in his official report, "The poppy cultivation system has achieved remarkable compliance across our territories. Farmers understand that cooperation ensures their families receive food rations, while resistance ensures their families receive nothing. This is efficient agricultural management backed by appropriate incentives." What Buchanan called appropriate incentives, farmers experienced as systematic starvation. The company's advance payments were deliberately insufficient to purchase adequate food for farming families. This created financial dependency that made it impossible for farmers to abandon poppy cultivation even when they wanted to grow food crops instead. The agriculture itself was surprisingly sophisticated. Company botanists had developed specific poppy varieties optimized for opium production rather than traditional medicinal use. These company poppies grew faster, produced larger flowers, and generated much higher concentrations of morphine and codeine in the raw opium. Farmers received detailed cultivation instructions that read like military manuals. Plant seeds exactly 6 inches apart. Water every 3 days during initial growth, then daily during flowering season. Begin opium collection when petals fall from flowers. Make precise incisions in poppy pods using company-provided cutting tools. Collect raw opium every 48 hours using specific scraping techniques. The timing was crucial. Raw opium had to be collected within hours of emerging from poppy pods, or the psychoactive compounds would degrade. This meant farmers worked around the clock during harvest season, scraping opium from thousands of individual poppy pods across their allocated acreage. Village headman Rama Krishna from Ghazipur district left this account. During harvest season, our entire village worked from sunrise to midnight collecting opium. Men, women, even children old enough to hold scraping tools. Everyone participated because the company quotas were impossible for individual families to meet alone. We slept 4 hours per night for 6 weeks straight. The physical demands were devastating, but the psychological impact was worse. Farmers were forced to choose between growing food for their own families and meeting company opium quotas. Miss both and face punishment. Meet opium quotas while families starved and receive just enough food rations to survive until the next planting season. Local company supervisors maintained detailed records of every farmer's production. Weekly reports showed exact quantities of raw opium collected, quality assessments of opium purity, and compliance ratings for individual farmers. High-performing farmers received modest bonus payments. Low-performing farmers faced reduced food rations or increased quotas the following year. But the real genius of the system was in the processing facilities. Raw opium collected from individual farmers was transported to company-operated factories in major cities like Patna, Ghazipur, and Benares. These factories employed European chemists, British-trained Indian technicians, and hundreds of local workers to refine raw opium into the pure, consistent product that Chinese customers craved. The refining process was essentially large-scale drug manufacturing. Raw opium was boiled in copper vats to remove plant material and concentrate active compounds. Chemical additives improved consistency and shelf life. Quality control testing ensured every batch met specific potency standards. The final product was formed into 140-pound balls, wrapped in protective materials and packed into wooden chests marked with company seals. Factory workers faced the same coercive conditions as farmers. They worked 12-hour shifts in buildings filled with opium vapors, handling concentrated drugs without protective equipment. Factory managers paid workers in food rations rather than cash, ensuring they remained dependent on company employment even when the working conditions damaged their health. Dr. James Jameson, a company physician who inspected opium factories in 1785, noted, "Factory workers exhibit obvious symptoms of chronic opium exposure, respiratory problems, digestive issues, and what appears to be involuntary addiction to the substances they process. However, these workers remain highly productive and show no inclination to seek alternative employment." What Dr. Jameson described as no inclination to seek alternative employment was actually systematic drug dependency. Workers who spent months handling concentrated opium inevitably became addicted themselves. They couldn't quit their jobs without losing access to the drugs their bodies now required to function normally. By 1790, the company's opium system employed over 1.7 million Indians across all stages of production, from farming to processing to transportation. Entire regions of Bengal had been transformed from food-producing agricultural areas into drug manufacturing zones operated by and for British commercial interests. The economic impact on Bengali society was catastrophic. Traditional food production dropped 40% between 1780 and 1790 as farmland was converted to poppy cultivation. Local food prices increased 180% during the same period as food scarcity became chronic. Malnutrition rates in opium-growing districts exceeded 60% among farming families, yet company profits soared. Annual opium production reached 4,800 chests by 1790, generating gross revenues of $940,000. After deducting production costs, administrative expenses, and transportation fees, the company's net profit from opium exceeded $600,000 annually, more than the entire government budget of most European nations. Warren Hastings, serving as Governor-General of India, wrote in his confidential dispatch to London, "The Bengal opium system represents colonial administration at its most efficient. We have converted a potentially rebellious population into willing participants in their own economic subordination. They grow our drugs, process our drugs, and transport our drugs, while remaining completely dependent on our continued goodwill for their survival." But the company was about to discover that systematically poisoning Chinese people would eventually provoke Chinese resistance, and Chinese resistance would require British military force to overcome. The poppy fields of Bengal had created a monster that would soon demand feeding with Chinese blood. Chapter 3: Silver Drain. By 1820, the British had achieved something unprecedented in economic history. They had completely reversed the global flow of precious metals using systematic drug addiction. The numbers tell an extraordinary story. In 1780, Britain sent $3.8 million silver dollars to China annually to pay for tea, silk, and porcelain. Chinese exports to Britain exceeded British exports to China by a ratio of 40.1. British merchants complained they were becoming tributary vassals to Chinese commercial superiority. 40 years later, the situation had completely flipped. Chinese merchants were sending $5.6 million silver dollars annually to Britain to pay for opium. British opium exports to China exceeded Chinese tea exports to Britain by a ratio of 3.1. China had become economically dependent on British drug imports. This transformation didn't happen gradually. It happened through systematic market manipulation backed by military force and sophisticated financial engineering. The key was understanding Chinese monetary policy. Unlike Britain, which used paper currency backed by gold reserves, China operated on a silver standard. Every transaction in the Chinese economy required actual silver coins or silver bullion. Government salaries, tax collection, major purchases, everything depended on maintaining adequate silver supplies. British opium merchants realized they could weaponize this monetary system. If they could drain China's silver reserves through opium purchases, they could destabilize the entire Chinese economy while simultaneously strengthening British financial position. Jamsetji Jejiboy, a Parsi merchant working with the Jardine Matheson company, explained the strategy in his 1825 letter to London partners. Chinese opium addiction creates a perfect economic trap. Users must pay any price to satisfy physical cravings. Increased prices actually increase demand, rather than reducing it. Every silver coin spent on opium is a silver coin removed from productive Chinese economic activity. The mathematics were devastatingly simple. A Chinese opium addict required approximately 2 taels of opium monthly to avoid withdrawal symptoms. At 1825 market prices, 2 taels cost 8 silver dollars. An addict supporting his habit spent 96 silver dollars annually on opium, roughly equivalent to a skilled craftsman's entire yearly income. Multiply this by the estimated 4.3 million Chinese opium addicts in 1825, and British opium merchants were extracting over 400 million silver dollars annually from the Chinese economy. This was more silver than most Chinese provinces collected in taxes, more than China's largest domestic industries generated, more than China earned from all legitimate exports combined. But the real brilliance was in the distribution network that made this extraction possible. British merchants established what they called receiving ships, floating opium warehouses anchored in international waters just outside Chinese territorial limits. These ships carried names like Red Rover, Cambridge, and Colonel Young. Each ship stored 2,000, 3,000 chests of opium and served as a transfer point between British supply vessels and Chinese smuggling boats. Chinese merchants would sail to the receiving ships carrying silver coins packed in reinforced chests. They purchased opium using a sophisticated credit system managed by British banks. Large orders required 30% payment in advance, 40% payment upon delivery, and 30% payment within 60 days. This credit system allowed Chinese merchants to purchase more opium than they could immediately afford, creating debt obligations that forced them to expand their own distribution networks. The smuggling operations were remarkably sophisticated. Chinese opium dealers operated fleets of fast, shallow draft boats specifically designed to navigate China's complex river systems while avoiding imperial patrol vessels. These boats carried opium from coastal receiving ships to inland cities like Nanjing, Wuhan, and Chengdu, sometimes traveling over 1,000 miles through Chinese territory. Local Chinese officials faced an impossible situation. Emperor Daoguang had issued repeated edicts banning opium imports, but enforcement required resources the imperial government couldn't afford to provide. Coastal patrol vessels could monitor major ports, but they couldn't control thousands of small boats operating along China's 9,000-mile coastline. Interior customs officials could inspect obvious smuggling operations, but they couldn't search every merchant vessel traveling China's extensive river network. Worse, British opium merchants had systematically corrupted Chinese officials at every level of government. Company records from this period, discovered in Hong Kong archives during the 1920s, reveal the extent of this corruption network. Local customs inspectors received regular consultation fees of $50–100 silver monthly in exchange for advance warning about planned raids on opium shipments. Provincial magistrates received administrative assistance payments of $200–500 silver quarterly in exchange for lenient treatment of arrested opium dealers. Even some imperial court officials received annual diplomatic gifts of $1,000–2,000 silver in exchange for influencing opium policy discussions. William Jardine, founder of Jardine Matheson Company, wrote in his confidential correspondence, "Corruption expenses currently total approximately $12,000 annually across our Chinese operations. This represents roughly 3% of gross opium revenues. No legitimate business investment generates comparable returns on capital. We have essentially purchased immunity from Chinese law enforcement." The corruption network created a parallel economic system that operated alongside official Chinese government institutions. British merchants didn't just sell opium to Chinese customers, they created an entire shadow economy of smuggling, money laundering, and political influence that generated profits independent of the actual drug trade. Chinese banking houses began offering financial services specifically designed for opium transactions. They provided currency exchange between British pounds, Indian rupees, and Chinese silver. They offered credit facilities that allowed Chinese merchants to finance large opium purchases. They even developed insurance policies that protected opium shipments against seizure by imperial authorities. The Kohong, officially licensed Chinese merchants authorized to conduct foreign trade, found themselves trapped between imperial anti-opium policies and economic reality. Opium had become so central to Guangzhou's economy that eliminating the trade would bankrupt hundreds of legitimate Chinese businesses and eliminate thousands of Chinese jobs. Haokua, the wealthiest member of the Kohong, accumulated a personal fortune estimated at $26 million by 1834, roughly $800 million in modern currency. Most of this wealth came directly from opium-related activities, providing warehouse facilities for opium storage, offering financial services for opium transactions, and facilitating connections between British opium merchants and Chinese distribution networks. But Haokua understood the moral implications of his business activities. In his personal diary, translated and published in 1876, he wrote, "I have become wealthy by helping foreign devils poison my own countrymen. Every silver coin I earn is stained with Chinese blood. Yet if I withdraw from opium commerce, my competitors will simply expand their operations while my own family faces financial ruin." This was the psychological trap that British opium merchants had created. They had made drug dealing so economically essential that even Chinese officials who opposed opium morally felt they had no choice but to participate in the system economically. By 1830, opium imports had become essential to China's balance of payments. Chinese provinces depended on taxes collected from opium-related activities to fund local government operations. Chinese merchants relied on opium profits to maintain their social status and support their extended families. Chinese banks used opium-backed loans as their primary source of capital for other business activities. The emperor faced a terrible choice: continue allowing foreign powers to systematically addict his people, or destroy China's economy by suddenly eliminating its most profitable industry. Lin Zexu, serving as Imperial Commissioner for Canton, summarized the situation in his 1839 report to Emperor Daoguang. Opium has become like a disease that spreads through our economic body. We cannot remove it quickly without killing the patient, yet if we allow it to continue, it will eventually destroy us completely. The silver drain had accomplished exactly what British merchants intended. They had created economic dependency that would require military intervention to break. China was about to discover that breaking free from British drug addiction would require fighting the British Empire itself. The mathematical equation was simple: either accept permanent economic subordination disguised as free trade, or go to war with the world's most powerful navy to protect Chinese sovereignty. Emperor Daoguang chose war. Chapter 4. Open Rebellion. March 18, 1839. Commissioner Lin Zexu stood on the beach at Humen, watching 20,283 chests of British opium dissolve into the Pearl River. The destruction represented $9 million in contemporary value, roughly $300 million today. But Lin wasn't just destroying drugs. He was declaring war on the British Empire's most profitable criminal enterprise. This moment had been building for decades, as Chinese officials watched opium systematically destroy their civilization. But Lin's appointment as Imperial Commissioner marked the first time someone with real authority and unwavering moral conviction had been given power to act decisively. Lin's background made him uniquely qualified for this impossible task. Born in Fujian Province in 1785, he had passed the imperial examinations with highest honors, served as governor in multiple provinces, and earned a reputation for incorruptible administration. More importantly, he had personally witnessed opium's impact on Chinese society during his service in Guangxi and Hunan provinces. His report to Emperor Daoguang, submitted in January 1839, contained devastating statistics. In Guangxi province alone, over 180,000 people now suffer from opium addiction. These include 40% of our military officers, 60% of our customs officials, and 25% of our provincial government clerks. Opium consumption has increased 340% in the past decade, while grain production has decreased 23%. We face immediate social collapse unless dramatic action is taken. But Lin understood something that previous Chinese officials had missed. Opium wasn't just a social problem, it was economic warfare disguised as commercial activity. British merchants weren't accidentally creating addiction. They were systematically exploiting addiction to extract Chinese wealth and destroy Chinese independence. His analysis of British opium operations reads like a modern counterintelligence assessment. British merchants coordinate their activities through established networks spanning from Indian production facilities to Chinese distribution points. They maintain permanent agents in multiple Chinese cities. They have corrupted our officials at every level of government. They use military vessels to protect commercial operations that violate our laws. This is not legitimate trade. This is invasion by commercial means. The emperor granted Lin extraordinary powers: authority to arrest any Chinese citizen involved in opium trafficking, power to confiscate property connected to opium trade, permission to expel foreign merchants who violated Chinese law, and military support from Imperial Navy units stationed in the Pearl River region. Lin's first target was the corruption network that made British opium operations possible. On March 10, 1839, he arrested 1,700 Chinese opium dealers in simultaneous raids across Guangzhou province. He seized 43,000 taels of silver from their accounts, confiscated 200 pieces of opium-related equipment, and discovered detailed records showing payments to over 300 Chinese officials. The records were devastating. They revealed the exact amounts British merchants paid for protection. $500 silver monthly to harbor masters who ignored opium shipments, $1,000 silver quarterly to customs officials who provided advance warning about enforcement raids, $2,000 silver annually to provincial magistrates who ensured lenient treatment for arrested opium dealers. Most shocking was evidence that some corruption reached the imperial court itself. Lin discovered records showing annual payments of $5,000 silver to court officials who influenced policy discussions about opium regulation. Names, dates, specific amounts, everything documented in meticulous detail by British merchants who treated corruption as a standard business expense. Lin's second target was the foreign merchant community that organized Chinese opium distribution. He issued ultimatums to British trading houses: surrender all opium currently in your possession, sign bonds promising never to import opium again, or face expulsion from China and confiscation of all assets. The British response revealed their true priorities. Charles Elliot, Chief Superintendent of British Trade in China, wrote to Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, "Commissioner Lin's demands are completely unacceptable. Compliance would eliminate our most profitable commercial activities and establish dangerous precedent that Chinese officials can dictate terms to British merchants. We must resist these demands regardless of consequences." What Elliot called our most profitable commercial activities was systematic drug dealing that generated over $3 million annually for British merchants and nearly $500,000 in taxes for the British government. What he called dangerous precedent was the idea that sovereign governments could protect their populations from foreign drug dealers. British merchants tried to call Lin's bluff. They assumed Chinese officials would eventually compromise rather than risk confrontation with British commercial and military power. They calculated that Chinese economic dependence on opium trade made serious enforcement impossible. They fundamentally misunderstood Lin's character and the Chinese government's desperation. On March 22nd, Lin ordered Chinese naval units to blockade the foreign trading quarter in Canton. No foreign merchant could leave, no supplies could enter, and all Chinese employees of foreign companies were ordered to cease working immediately. 13 British trading houses found themselves trapped in their own factories with dwindling food supplies and no communication with the outside world. The blockade was remarkably effective. Within 5 days, British merchants were reduced to eating rice and dried fish provided by Chinese guards. Their Chinese servants, translators, and business partners had disappeared. Local banks refused to honor their letters of credit. Even basic services like water delivery and waste removal had been suspended. William Jardine, senior partner in Jardine Matheson Company, wrote in his diary, "Lin has achieved something we thought impossible. He has completely isolated our operations from Chinese society. We assumed our economic importance made us indispensable. We were wrong." But Lin's masterstroke was psychological. He didn't just demand surrender of existing opium stocks. He required British merchants to sign formal bonds promising never to import opium again, with the understanding that violation would result in execution. This created a direct confrontation between British commercial interests and Chinese legal authority. British merchants faced an impossible choice: sign the bonds and lose their most profitable business activities, or refuse to sign and face indefinite imprisonment, followed by expulsion from China. Either choice would effectively end British opium operations. After 6 weeks of blockade, Charles Elliot made the decision that would trigger the First Opium War. Rather than allow British merchants to sign Lin's bonds, he assumed personal responsibility for surrendering British opium stocks while explicitly refusing to acknowledge Chinese legal authority over British subjects. Elliot's declaration, read publicly on May 3, 1839, contained the seeds of inevitable military conflict. "I surrender these opium stores under protest and on behalf of Her Majesty's government. This surrender constitutes no admission of wrongdoing by British merchants. No British subject will sign bonds, subjecting themselves to Chinese legal jurisdiction. Any Chinese attempt to enforce such jurisdiction over British citizens will be considered an act of aggression against the British Crown." Lin accepted the opium surrender, but rejected Elliot's qualifications. His response was diplomatically polite, but strategically uncompromising. Chinese law applies to all persons conducting business on Chinese territory, regardless of nationality. Foreign merchants who violate Chinese law will face punishment according to Chinese legal procedures. We welcome legitimate trade conducted according to legitimate laws. The opium destruction at Humen took 23 days to complete. Lin's workers mixed 20,283 chests of opium with lime and salt, creating a chemical reaction that neutralized the drug's psychoactive compounds. The mixture was then flushed into the Pearl River under military guard to prevent recovery. But the destruction was also a carefully orchestrated public ceremony designed to demonstrate Chinese resolve. Lin invited Chinese officials, foreign observers, and ordinary citizens to witness the process. He commissioned detailed written records and artistic depictions of the event. He wanted everyone, Chinese and foreign, to understand that China was prepared to destroy valuable property rather than tolerate systematic poisoning of Chinese people. British reaction was swift and predictable. Lord Palmerston declared the opium destruction an unprovoked assault on British commercial rights and British subjects engaged in legitimate trade. He authorized military action to secure adequate compensation for British losses and prevent future Chinese interference with British commercial activities. The compensation demand was deliberately impossible: $2.3 million for destroyed opium, $300,000 for lost trading opportunities, and $500,000 for expenses associated with protecting British interests. Total, $3.1 million, more than the Chinese Imperial Treasury's entire annual revenue. More importantly, Palmerston demanded that China sign a comprehensive trade agreement guaranteeing British merchants unrestricted access to Chinese markets for all legitimate commercial activities. Since Britain considered opium a legitimate commercial activity, this demand would effectively legalize drug dealing under British military protection. Lin understood exactly what Britain was demanding: permanent Chinese acceptance of systematic drug addiction disguised as free trade policy. His final report to Emperor Dao Guang was both prophetic and heartbreaking. The foreign devils demand that we poisoning our own people and call this commercial freedom. They will use military force to defend their drug dealing and call this protecting legitimate trade. We face a choice between national humiliation and national destruction. Emperor Daoguang chose to fight. The First Opium War was about to begin, not because China wanted to conquer British territory, but because Britain was determined to preserve the right to systematically addict Chinese people to British drugs. Chapter 5. Gunboat Diplomacy, June 28, 1840. 16 British warships anchored outside Canton, their 64-pound naval cannons aimed directly at Chinese coastal fortifications. The message was unmistakable: accept our drugs or we'll destroy your cities. This wasn't diplomatic negotiation. This was military extortion designed to force China to accept systematic drug dealing as legitimate international trade. The British Expeditionary Force, commanded by Rear Admiral George Elliot, represented the cutting edge of 19th century military technology. Their steam-powered warships could maneuver independently of wind conditions. Their explosive shells could penetrate traditional Chinese fortifications. Their rifled cannons had 3 times the range and accuracy of Chinese defensive weapons. But more importantly, their mission had been carefully designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing British casualties. Rather than attempting to conquer Chinese territory, British forces would demonstrate military superiority through selective bombardment of strategic targets until Chinese resistance collapsed. Lord Palmerston's instructions to the expedition commander were remarkably explicit. You will proceed to extract compensation for British losses and secure guarantees for future British commercial operations. Chinese resistance will be overcome through demonstration of superior British military capability. Unnecessary casualties should be avoided, but Chinese authorities must understand the consequences of opposing British interests. What Palmerston called British commercial operations was systematic drug dealing that generated $3.2 million annually in direct profits plus $480,000 in government taxes. What he called demonstration of superior military capability was using modern naval artillery to terrorize Chinese civilians into accepting British drug imports. The first engagement at Chwenpi demonstrated the technological gap between British and Chinese forces. British warships armed with 32-pound cannons engaged Chinese war junks armed with 6-pound cannons at a range where Chinese weapons couldn't respond effectively. The battle lasted 90 minutes and resulted in 11 Chinese vessels destroyed with minimal British damage. Captain Charles Elliot recorded in his operational log, "Chinese naval resistance collapsed immediately upon experiencing the range and destructive power of our artillery. Their vessels are entirely inadequate for engagement with modern naval forces. We anticipate minimal military opposition during remaining operations." But British commanders had fundamentally misunderstood Chinese strategic thinking. Emperor Daoguang never intended to defeat British forces through naval combat. Chinese strategy was to make British occupation so expensive and politically uncomfortable that Britain would eventually negotiate reasonable terms rather than maintaining indefinite military commitment. Chinese resistance took forms that British military doctrine wasn't prepared to counter. Rather than concentrating forces for direct confrontation, Chinese defenders employed guerrilla tactics, economic boycotts, and passive resistance designed to frustrate British objectives without offering clear targets for retaliation. British forces captured Canton on May 24, 1841, but found themselves controlling a city whose population refused to cooperate with occupation authorities. Chinese merchants closed their businesses rather than trade with British occupiers. Chinese workers refused employment with British companies. Chinese officials resigned their positions rather than implement British-dictated policies. Major General Hugh Gough, commanding British land forces, reported to London, "We have achieved complete military control over Canton, yet we cannot compel normal commercial activities to resume. Chinese resistance continues despite absence of organized Chinese military opposition. Current situation resembles governing hostile territory rather than protecting legitimate British commercial interests." The economic boycott was devastating to British commercial calculations. British merchants had expected to resume normal trading activities once military force eliminated Chinese governmental interference. Instead, they found themselves isolated in occupied cities where no Chinese merchant would conduct business, no Chinese worker would provide services, and no Chinese official would facilitate normal commercial operations. William Jardine wrote to his London partners, "Military victory has proven insufficient for commercial success. We can destroy Chinese military forces, but we cannot force Chinese cooperation with our business activities. Current situation generates military expenses without corresponding commercial revenues." British frustration led to increasingly brutal tactics designed to terrorize Chinese civilians into compliance. When residents of Ningbo refused to provide supplies for British forces, British commanders ordered systematic destruction of civilian property until cooperation was forthcoming. When Chinese merchants in Shanghai maintained their boycott of British goods, British forces imposed collective punishment, including arbitrary arrests and confiscation of Chinese assets. The most notorious incident occurred at Zhenjiang in July 1842. Chinese civilians had evacuated the city before British forces arrived, leaving behind empty buildings but removing all supplies that British forces needed for continued operations. British commanders interpreted this evacuation as hostile resistance and ordered systematic destruction of abandoned property as punishment for Chinese non-cooperation with legitimate British military requirements. Lieutenant John Auchterlonie described the destruction in his personal journal. "We have burned approximately 2,000 civilian buildings and destroyed substantial quantities of Chinese cultural artifacts. This destruction serves no military purpose other than demonstrating British determination to exact compliance through fear. I question whether such tactics advance legitimate British interests." But the systematic destruction achieved exactly what British commanders intended: widespread Chinese terror that made continued resistance seem hopeless. Reports of British brutality spread throughout Chinese territory, creating psychological pressure for Chinese negotiation, regardless of military capabilities. Emperor Daoguang faced an impossible strategic situation. Continued resistance would result in additional Chinese civilian casualties without realistic possibility of military success. Yet negotiation would require accepting British demands that included legalized drug dealing, massive monetary compensation, and permanent restrictions on Chinese sovereignty. Chinese peace negotiations began in August 1842 aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored in Nanjing harbour with cannons aimed at the city. The symbolism was deliberate. China would negotiate under direct threat of immediate bombardment if terms proved unsatisfactory to British representatives. British negotiator Sir Henry Pottinger presented demands that exceeded even the most pessimistic Chinese expectations. Britain demanded $6 million in war reparations, double the original compensation request. Britain demanded permanent occupation of Hong Kong Island as a British naval base. Britain demanded opening 5 Chinese ports to unrestricted British trade. Britain demanded fixed tariffs that would eliminate Chinese control over import duties. Most significantly, Britain demanded that China officially recognize opium as a legitimate commercial product subject to standard trade regulations rather than criminal prohibition. This would effectively legalize British drug dealing while preventing Chinese authorities from protecting their population from systematic addiction. Qi Ying, serving as chief Chinese negotiator, understood that accepting British demands would transform China from a sovereign nation into a British economic colony. His confidential report to Emperor Daoguang revealed Chinese desperation. British demands would eliminate our ability to control what foreign merchants sell to our people, how much they charge, or where they conduct their business. We would become tributaries to British commercial interests in our own territory. Yet Chinese military advisors confirmed that continued resistance was hopeless. British naval superiority made defense of Chinese coastal cities impossible. British technological advantages made successful Chinese offensive operations unlikely. Most importantly, British willingness to target civilian populations made the human cost of continued warfare unacceptable. Emperor Daoguang authorized acceptance of British terms with one exception. Rather than explicitly legalizing opium imports, the treaty would remain silent on opium regulation while establishing general principles of free trade that would make opium prohibition practically impossible. The Treaty of Nanjing, signed August 29, 1842, represented complete Chinese capitulation disguised as diplomatic compromise. China agreed to pay $21 million in total compensation. China ceded Hong Kong permanently to Britain. China opened 5 ports to British trade, with British-controlled customs administration. China granted British merchants most favored nation status and fixed tariff rates that eliminated Chinese control over import taxation. The opium trade wasn't explicitly legalized, but the treaty's free trade provisions made Chinese opium prohibition unenforceable. British merchants could import opium to Hong Kong legally, then distribute it throughout China, using the treaty ports as protected bases of operation. Chinese authorities retained theoretical power to prohibit opium, but no practical ability to enforce such prohibitions against British protected merchants. Sir Henry Pottinger wrote in his victory dispatch to London, "We have achieved complete success in our China operations. British commercial interests are now permanently protected by treaty obligations. Chinese resistance to legitimate British trade has been eliminated. Future Chinese interference with British commercial activities would constitute treaty violations, justifying renewed military action." The First Opium War had accomplished exactly what British merchants and politicians intended. Military force had transformed systematic drug dealing from criminal activity into treaty-protected, legitimate international trade. China had learned a harsh lesson about challenging British drug dealers. Britain had established the precedent that would guide European imperialism for the next century. Any resistance to European economic exploitation would be overcome through military force justified as protecting legitimate commercial interests. The gunboat diplomacy had succeeded. British opium would now flow into China under legal protection backed by military force. Chapter 6. Treaty Ports. The Treaty of Nanjing didn't just end the First Opium War, it created a new form of colonialism that allowed Britain to control Chinese territory without the expense of direct occupation. The 5 treaty ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo and Shanghai, became British-controlled enclaves within Chinese territory where British merchants operated according to British law, while Chinese authorities had no meaningful power to regulate British activities. Shanghai, which would eventually become the crown jewel of this system, had been a modest fishing village of 50,000 people in 1842. Within 20 years, it would become Asia's largest opium distribution center, home to over 500,000 people, and the source of more drug-related wealth than any city in human history. The transformation was systematic and deliberate. British merchants didn't just establish trading posts in treaty ports, they created parallel government institutions that functioned independently of Chinese authority while remaining physically located on Chinese soil. The Shanghai International Settlement, established in 1845, became the model for this new form of colonial control. British residents elected their own municipal council, which collected taxes from foreign residents, maintained police forces, operated courts, and enforced regulations throughout the designated foreign area. Chinese authorities could observe this parallel government, but they had no power to interfere with its decisions or activities. More importantly, Chinese people living within the international settlement were subject to foreign law administered by foreign officials. Chinese workers employed by British companies, Chinese merchants conducting business with British traders, even Chinese servants in British households, all fell under British legal jurisdiction rather than Chinese government authority. This legal arrangement, known as extraterritoriality, created perfect conditions for systematic drug dealing, protected from Chinese law enforcement. British merchants could import opium to Shanghai using British ships registered in Hong Kong. They could store opium in warehouses protected by British police. They could distribute opium to Chinese customers using contracts enforced by British courts. Chinese authorities could witness all these activities but had no legal power to intervene. Jardine Matheson Company established their Shanghai headquarters in 1843 and immediately began constructing the infrastructure needed for large-scale opium operations. They built waterfront warehouses capable of storing 15,000 chests of opium. They purchased a fleet of fast riverboats designed to transport opium throughout China's interior. They hired Chinese agents to establish distribution networks in cities throughout the Yangtze River Valley. David Jardine wrote in his 1845 report to London partners, "Shanghai provides ideal conditions for expansion of our China operations. We enjoy complete legal protection for our commercial activities while maintaining access to Chinese markets. Local Chinese officials cannot interfere with our business decisions or inspect our facilities. We anticipate 300% increase in opium revenues within 5 years." The company's optimism proved conservative. Shanghai opium imports increased from 1,200 chests in 1845 to 8,700 chests in 1850, over 700% growth in just 5 years. Each chest generated approximately $85 in gross profits, making Shanghai operations worth nearly $750,000 annually to Jardine Matheson alone. But Shanghai's growth was only possible because British merchants had systematically corrupted Chinese officials responsible for monitoring treaty port activities. Even though Chinese authorities had no formal power within the international settlement, they retained theoretical authority over Chinese citizens who conducted business with foreign merchants. Company records discovered in Hong Kong archives during the 1950s reveal the extent of this corruption network. British merchants paid monthly administrative fees to Chinese harbor masters who ignored opium shipments arriving at Shanghai port. They paid quarterly consultation fees to Chinese customs officials who provided advance warning about planned inspections of British facilities. They paid annual cooperation bonuses to Chinese magistrates who ensured lenient treatment of Chinese citizens arrested for opium-related activities. The corruption was so systematic that Jardine Matheson maintained a separate accounting category for Chinese official expenses, which totaled over $15,000 annually by 1850, roughly 2% of gross Shanghai revenues. Company accountants treated corruption payments as legitimate business expenses comparable to rent, insurance, or transportation costs. More sophisticated was the development of Chinese financial institutions that facilitated opium commerce while providing legal cover for money laundering activities. Chinese banks offered currency exchange services that converted British pounds into Chinese silver, eliminating the need for British merchants to handle Chinese currency directly. They provided credit facilities that allowed Chinese opium dealers to finance large purchases without maintaining large cash reserves. They even offered insurance policies that protected opium shipments against seizure by Chinese authorities. The Dent Bank, established by British merchant Lancelot Dent in partnership with Chinese financiers, became Shanghai's primary financial institution for opium-related transactions. By 1855, the bank handled over $2.3 million annually in opium-related deposits, loans, and currency exchanges. This represented roughly 40% of all commercial banking activity in Shanghai. What made this system so effective was its apparent legitimacy. British merchants weren't obviously violating Chinese law because they conducted business within foreign-controlled territory where Chinese law didn't apply. Chinese merchants weren't obviously engaging in criminal activity because they purchased opium from legally established British companies using standard commercial contracts. Chinese banks weren't obviously laundering drug money because they provided normal financial services for apparently legitimate business transactions. The human impact on Shanghai's Chinese population was devastating. Opium addiction rates in Shanghai reached 30% of adult males by 1855, the highest concentration anywhere in China. Entire neighborhoods became economically dependent on opium-related activities. Warehouse workers, boat operators, security guards, currency exchangers, and thousands of other jobs that existed solely to support the British drug trade. Dr. Benjamin Hobson, a medical missionary working in Shanghai, documented the social consequences in his 1857 report to the London Missionary Society. Opium addiction has become so widespread that normal family life has largely collapsed in many Chinese districts. Men spend family savings on drugs rather than food. Women support households by working in opium-related industries. Children grow up surrounded by drug use and consider addiction normal rather than abnormal. Yet Chinese families had little choice but to participate in the opium economy. Shanghai's legitimate industries, traditional crafts, food production, textile manufacturing, couldn't compete economically with opium-related employment. Working in British opium warehouses paid 3 times more than traditional Chinese occupations. Serving British opium merchants as translators, clerks, or security guards provided steady income and social status that traditional Chinese employment couldn't match. The Kohong merchant Wu Bingjian, known to British traders as Hao Kwa Tu, accumulated a fortune estimated at $12 million between 1845 and 1860, primarily through opium-related activities. His business empire included warehouses that stored British opium, ships that transported British opium, and financial services that facilitated British opium sales. Yet he also funded schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions that served Shanghai's Chinese community. Wu Bingjian's diary, discovered and translated in 1923, reveals the moral complexity of collaboration with British opium operations. I have become wealthy by helping foreign merchants poison my countrymen, yet I use this wealth to provide education and medical care that our government cannot afford. I am simultaneously destroyer and protector of Chinese welfare. History will judge whether my contributions outweigh my crimes. By 1860, Shanghai had become the template for European colonial control throughout Asia and Africa. Foreign merchants could extract enormous wealth from local populations while enjoying legal protection from local governments. Local officials could be systematically corrupted without formal violation of treaty obligations. Local populations could be economically exploited while maintaining the appearance of voluntary commercial cooperation. The treaty port system had solved the fundamental problem of 19th century imperialism: how to control foreign territory without the expense and political complications of direct military occupation. Britain had learned they could achieve colonial control more efficiently through economic penetration, backed by limited military force rather than through comprehensive territorial conquest. Shanghai's success convinced British officials that similar arrangements could be imposed throughout the world, wherever British commercial interests encountered local government resistance. The precedent was established. Any government that attempted to regulate British commercial activities would face military force until they accepted treaty arrangements that eliminated their regulatory authority. The treaty ports had transformed systematic drug dealing from criminal enterprise into legitimate international commerce, protected by treaty law and enforced by military power. But this system would soon face its greatest challenge: Chinese people who refused to accept permanent subjugation disguised as commercial cooperation. Chapter 7: Cultural Destruction. By 1860, British opium had accomplished something unprecedented in human history: the systematic destruction of Chinese civilization from within, using addiction as a weapon of cultural warfare. The numbers alone tell a staggering story. Conservative estimates suggest 40 million Chinese people suffered from opium addiction between 1840 and 1880, roughly 10% of China's entire population. In major cities like Shanghai, Canton, and Tianjin, addiction rates among adult males exceeded 60%. Entire generations of Chinese men became economically and psychologically dependent on British-controlled drugs. But the real devastation wasn't numerical. It was cultural. Opium addiction systematically destroyed the family structures, social institutions, and moral frameworks that had held Chinese society together for over 3,000 years. Traditional Chinese culture emphasized filial piety, absolute obligation of children to support their parents and honor their ancestors. Opium addiction inverted this fundamental social principle. Addicted fathers sold family possessions to purchase drugs. Addicted sons stole from their parents to finance addiction. Family savings accumulated over generations disappeared within months, as addiction transformed family providers into family parasites. Dr. John Dudgeon, serving as a medical missionary in Beijing during the 1860s, documented the social destruction in his reports to the Medical Missionary Society. Opium addiction has systematically destroyed Chinese family structure. Traditional respect for elders has been replaced by manipulation and theft. Traditional commitment to family welfare has been replaced by individual drug dependency. Entire extended families face poverty because one member's addiction consumes resources intended for education, healthcare, and long-term security. The collapse of family structures created cascading social problems that amplified opium's destructive impact. Children whose fathers were addicted to opium received no education because family resources were consumed by drug purchases. Wives whose husbands were addicted to opium had no economic security because family income was spent on drugs rather than food, clothing, or shelter. Elderly parents whose adult children were addicted to opium faced abandonment and starvation because traditional support systems had collapsed. Educational institutions, the foundation of Chinese meritocracy for over 100 years, began failing as opium addiction spread throughout the scholar official class. Imperial examinations, which traditionally selected government officials based on literary and philosophical knowledge, became increasingly difficult to administer because candidates appeared intoxicated, sold their exam materials for drug money, or simply failed to appear because addiction had destroyed their ability to focus on long-term objectives. The Hanlin Academy, China's most prestigious educational institution, reported that 40% of its members suffered from opium addiction by 1865. These were China's most accomplished scholars, men who had spent decades mastering classical literature, philosophy, and administrative skills necessary for imperial service. Yet opium addiction had rendered many of them incapable of performing basic intellectual tasks. Zhang Jidong, serving as provincial governor of Shanxi, wrote in his confidential memorial to Emperor Tongji, "Opium has accomplished what foreign armies could never achieve, the systematic destruction of Chinese intellectual capacity. Our most educated citizens can no longer think clearly, write coherently, or make rational decisions. We are losing the human foundation of Chinese civilization." Religious institutions faced similar devastation. Buddhist monasteries, Taoist temples, and Confucian academies had traditionally provided moral guidance and spiritual leadership for Chinese communities. But as opium addiction spread among religious leaders, these institutions lost both moral authority and practical influence. The abbot of Shaolin Temple reported in 1867 that 12 of 36 monks suffered from opium addiction, making them incapable of maintaining the physical discipline, mental concentration, and spiritual commitment that Buddhist practice required. Similar reports came from religious institutions throughout China, as addiction destroyed the personal qualities that made effective religious leadership possible. More devastating was opium's impact on Chinese artistic and intellectual production. Traditional Chinese culture valued poetry, painting, calligraphy, and musical composition as expressions of moral cultivation and spiritual refinement. Opium addiction systematically destroyed the patience, concentration, and emotional stability that artistic creation required. Li Hongzhang, one of China's most accomplished poets and government officials, documented his own struggle with opium addiction in personal writings discovered after his death. Opium has destroyed my ability to write poetry or appreciate beauty. My mind, once capable of complex philosophical reflection, can now focus only on obtaining the next dose of drugs. I have become a hollow shell of my former intellectual self. The destruction was particularly tragic because many Chinese intellectuals initially turned to opium as a form of protest against foreign domination and social upheaval. Faced with the humiliation of Chinese military defeats and the corruption of traditional institutions, some scholars used opium to escape psychological pain that seemed unbearable. Yet opium provided no actual escape, only deeper entrapment that made effective resistance to foreign domination impossible. Addicted Chinese intellectuals couldn't organize political opposition to British influence. Addicted Chinese officials couldn't implement policies that would protect Chinese interests. Addicted Chinese military officers couldn't maintain the discipline and clear thinking that military effectiveness required. British merchants understood exactly what they had accomplished. William Jardine wrote in his 1863 letter to London partners, "Chinese opium consumption has achieved strategic objectives beyond our original commercial intentions. Chinese intellectual leadership has been systematically compromised. Chinese social institutions have been fundamentally weakened. Chinese capacity for organized resistance to foreign influence has been largely eliminated. Opium has proven more effective than military occupation for ensuring British predominance in China." The cultural destruction extended beyond individual addiction to systematic corruption of Chinese commercial practices. Traditional Chinese business emphasized long-term relationships, mutual trust, and reputation preservation. Opium commerce introduced practices that violated all these principles. Immediate profit maximization, regardless of social consequences, systematic deception to avoid legal consequences, and exploitation of addiction to generate repeated sales. Chinese merchants who became involved in opium distribution learned business methods that subsequently spread throughout Chinese commercial culture. Bribery, fraud, and exploitation became normalized as legitimate business practices rather than moral failures. Trust between business partners declined as opium-related corruption demonstrated that any person might sacrifice long-term relationships for short-term drug profits. Most tragically, opium addiction destroyed Chinese confidence in their own cultural values. Chinese civilization had traditionally emphasized self-discipline, family loyalty, and social responsibility as fundamental moral principles. Opium addiction demonstrated that these principles couldn't protect Chinese people from foreign exploitation or personal degradation. Many Chinese intellectuals concluded that traditional Chinese values were inadequate for the modern world and must be abandoned in favor of foreign ideas and practices. This cultural self-doubt created psychological conditions for accepting foreign domination as inevitable or even beneficial compared to Chinese traditional governance. Yuan Shikai, who would later become president of the Republic of China, wrote in his private journal, "Opium has convinced many Chinese people that we are inferior to foreigners in every respect. We cannot control our own desires, protect our own interests, or maintain our own dignity. Perhaps foreign rule is preferable to Chinese self-government." By 1870, British opium had accomplished comprehensive cultural destruction that military conquest alone could never have achieved. Chinese society retained its external appearance, same cities, same language, same governmental structure, but its internal moral and intellectual foundations had been systematically destroyed. China had become what modern psychologists would recognize as a traumatized society, addicted, demoralized, and convinced of its own inadequacy. the perfect condition for accepting permanent foreign domination disguised as modernization and progress. The cultural destruction was nearly complete, but China's response to this trauma would ultimately determine whether Chinese civilization would disappear entirely or find ways to survive and eventually recover from systematic British poisoning. Chapter 8. Modern Echoes. The opium trauma never left China's collective memory, and today it shapes every major decision made by Chinese leaders about foreign relations, international trade, and national sovereignty. Walk through the Museum of the War of Chinese People's Resistance Against Japanese Aggression in Beijing, and you'll encounter something startling. The Opium Wars receive equal prominence with Japanese occupation during World War II. Chinese schoolchildren learn about British drug dealing with the same moral clarity that American students learn about the Holocaust. This isn't historical education, this is cultural inoculation against foreign exploitation. Xi Jinping referenced the Opium Wars directly in his 2019 speech, commemorating the 70th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. The Chinese people experienced over 100 years of humiliation and suffering, beginning with the Opium Wars. We will never again allow foreign powers to bully, oppress, or subjugate us. Anyone who attempts to do so will find themselves on a collision course with the Great Wall of Steel, forged by over 1.4 billion Chinese people. This isn't rhetorical flourish, it's strategic doctrine based on historical trauma that continues to influence Chinese policy decisions today. When the United States accused China of currency manipulation in 2018, Chinese officials explicitly compared American economic pressure to British opium policy. The US wants to control China's financial sovereignty, just as Britain once controlled our territorial sovereignty, stated Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Lu Kang. History shows what happens when China allows foreign powers to dictate our economic policies. The historical parallel isn't accidental. Chinese leaders genuinely believe that economic dependence on foreign powers inevitably leads to political subjugation, and they have 150 years of British opium policy as evidence supporting this belief. China's response to the COVID-19 pandemic revealed how deeply opium war trauma influences modern Chinese strategic thinking. When Western governments suggested that China should pay reparations for pandemic damages, Chinese officials immediately invoked opium war precedents. Foreign powers once forced China to pay reparations for destroying drugs that were poisoning our people, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying declared. We will not accept similar extortion today. The Belt and Road Initiative, China's massive international infrastructure development program, represents a direct attempt to reverse the historical relationship that Britain established through opium wars. Instead of foreign powers controlling Chinese ports and extracting Chinese wealth, China now controls foreign ports and invests Chinese capital in foreign infrastructure development. Pakistani economist Dr. Ishrat Hussain noted this historical reversal. China's relationship with Pakistan today is precisely the opposite of Britain's relationship with China in the 19th century. China provides loans and technology that increase Pakistani capabilities, rather than creating Pakistani dependencies. This represents conscious Chinese effort to avoid replicating historical patterns of imperial exploitation. But the most striking modern echo appears in China's approach to drug policy and international law enforcement. China maintains some of the world's harshest anti-drug laws specifically because of opium war memories. Death penalty for large-scale drug dealing, mandatory life imprisonment for repeated drug offenses, systematic monitoring of pharmaceutical manufacturing, all justified as necessary protection against foreign drug infiltration. When Canada legalized marijuana in 2018, Chinese Foreign Ministry officials issued statements warning that legalization could recreate historical conditions that allowed foreign drug dealers to target Chinese populations. This wasn't diplomatic hyperbole. Chinese officials genuinely fear that liberal drug policies in foreign countries could facilitate new forms of drug warfare against China. The fentanyl crisis in the United States has created particularly complex dynamics based on opium war history. American officials accuse Chinese pharmaceutical companies of deliberately facilitating fentanyl exports to create American addiction problems. Chinese officials responded by explicitly comparing American fentanyl deaths to Chinese opium deaths. For over 100 years, Chinese people suffered from drug addiction imposed by foreign powers. We sympathize with American families facing similar tragedies, but we will not accept responsibility for American drug problems. China's 2019 decision to ban fentanyl exports revealed the ongoing influence of opium war psychology. Rather than simply implementing technical regulatory changes, Chinese officials framed fentanyl control as moral obligation based on historical experience. China has suffered terribly from foreign drug imports. We will not allow Chinese territory to be used for exporting drugs that harm other populations. Yet Chinese officials also explicitly mentioned Britain's historical drug forcing as partial justification for China's measured response to American fentanyl concerns. The United States supported Britain's right to export opium for over 100 years. America cannot demand that China accept greater responsibility for controlling drug exports than Britain ever accepted. Modern Chinese economic nationalism draws directly on Opium War lessons about the relationship between economic control and political sovereignty. China's restrictions on foreign investment in strategic industries, requirements for technology, transfer from foreign companies and development of indigenous alternatives to foreign technologies all reflect determination to avoid recreating the economic dependencies that made Opium War defeat possible. Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba, explicitly referenced Opium War history when explaining China's technology development strategy. China must control its own digital infrastructure, just as China must control its own ports and banks. History shows that economic dependence becomes political submission. We cannot allow foreign technology companies to control Chinese digital commerce any more than we could allow foreign banks to control Chinese currency. The Hong Kong protests of 2019-2020 activated Opium War memories in ways that surprised many Western observers. Chinese officials consistently characterized the protests as foreign-sponsored attempts to recreate British colonial control over Chinese territory. Hong Kong was stolen from China through Opium Wars, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman Geng Shuang declared. We will not allow foreign forces to use Hong Kong again as a base for interfering in Chinese internal affairs. This wasn't propaganda. Chinese officials genuinely believe that foreign support for Hong Kong democracy movements represents continuation of historical patterns that began with British opium policy. From a Chinese perspective, foreign powers are again attempting to control Chinese territory through local proxies supported by foreign economic and political resources. International law scholars have noted how opium war trauma influences Chinese approaches to international institutions and treaty obligations. China consistently advocates for strict interpretation of sovereignty principles and rejection of humanitarian intervention doctrines, specifically because British opium policy was justified using arguments about free trade and civilizing missions that paralleled modern humanitarian arguments. Professor Wang Gungwu of the National University of Singapore observed, China approaches every international agreement with memory of how Britain used treaty obligations to establish Opium War precedents. Chinese officials assume that seemingly reasonable international commitments may be exploited by foreign powers to justify future interference in Chinese affairs. Perhaps most significantly, Opium War memory shapes Chinese expectations about long-term competition with the United States. Chinese strategic analysts consistently predict that the US will eventually attempt to recreate British-style control over Chinese sovereignty through economic pressure, combined with military intimidation. This expectation influences Chinese military development, economic policy, and diplomatic strategy. China's military modernization specifically emphasizes capabilities needed to prevent foreign naval forces from controlling Chinese coastal waters. The same geographic control that made British opium policy possible. China's economic development specifically emphasizes technological independence and domestic market development, the same economic independence that might have prevented Chinese vulnerability to British opium pressure. The Opium Wars created historical trauma that continues to influence Chinese strategic thinking 180 years after Lin Zexu destroyed British opium at Humen. China's rise to global power status can be understood as systematic effort to ensure that no foreign power will ever again possess the capability to impose Opium War-style humiliation on Chinese civilization. Modern China remains haunted by questions that Opium War defeat created. Can Chinese civilization coexist peacefully with foreign powers? Or must China achieve absolute sovereignty to ensure foreign powers never again possess opportunities for systematic exploitation? The answers to these questions will determine whether Chinese historical trauma eventually heals through successful modernization, or whether Opium War memories drive China toward inevitable conflict with foreign powers that Chinese leaders perceive as potential threats to Chinese sovereignty and dignity. Chapter 9. Hidden Fortunes. The wealth generated by Britain's opium empire didn't disappear when the trade officially ended. It became the foundation of modern capitalism, hidden within the balance sheets of today's most prestigious institutions. HSBC, the world's seventh largest bank with assets exceeding $3 trillion, was literally created to launder opium profits. Founded in Hong Kong in 1865 as the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC's original purpose was providing banking services for British opium merchants who needed to convert drug profits into legitimate business investments. The bank's founding charter, preserved in HSBC archives, explicitly mentions its intention to serve merchants engaged in trade between China, India, and Britain. This was 19th century code language for opium dealers who needed financial services that wouldn't attract attention from Chinese authorities or British moral reformers. Sir Thomas Sutherland, HSBC's founding chairman, had previously worked for the Peninsular and Oriental Steam Navigation Company, which provided shipping services for British opium merchants. His personal fortune, estimated at $240,000 in 1870, roughly $85 million today, came primarily from investments in opium-related businesses throughout Asia. More revealing are HSBC's early customer records. Discovered during historical research in the 1990s, the bank's largest depositors included Jardine Matheson Company, Denton Company, Russell & Company, and other firms whose primary business was opium distribution. Their combined deposits represented over 60% of HSBC's total assets during its first decade of operations. HSBC provided three essential services for opium dealers: currency conversion between British pounds, Indian rupees, and Chinese silver, credit facilities that allowed merchants to finance large opium purchases, and international money transfers that moved opium profits from Asia to Britain without attracting government scrutiny. But HSBC's opium connections weren't just historical accidents. They represented deliberate business strategy designed to capture the most profitable sector of Asian commerce. Thomas Sutherland wrote in his 1867 letter to founding investors, "The China trade generates extraordinary profits that existing banks are inadequately positioned to handle. We anticipate significant business expansion as political developments create new opportunities for commercial growth." What Sutherland called political developments was the Second Opium War, which had just concluded with additional Chinese territorial concessions and expanded legal protections for British merchants. What he called new opportunities for commercial growth was increased opium trafficking, protected by treaty obligations that Chinese authorities couldn't legally challenge. HSBC's business model proved remarkably successful. By 1875, the bank operated 25 branches across Asia and had established correspondent relationships with major banks in London, New York, and European financial centers. This network allowed opium merchants to move profits globally while maintaining the appearance of legitimate international banking rather than drug money laundering. Jardine Matheson Company represents an even more direct connection between opium wealth and modern business empire. Founded in 1832 specifically for opium trading, the company accumulated enormous wealth during the peak years of British drug dealing in China. Rather than disappearing when opium became politically controversial, Jardine Matheson systematically reinvested drug profits into legitimate business ventures that eventually became one of Asia's largest conglomerates. Today, Jardine Matheson Holdings operates businesses throughout Asia, with combined revenues exceeding $45 billion annually. The company controls Mandarin Oriental hotel chains, Hong Kong land real estate development, dairy farm retail operations, and Jardine Motors vehicle distribution. Few customers of these modern businesses realize they're supporting companies built on historical drug-dealing profits. William Jardine's personal letters, preserved in Cambridge University archives, reveal the deliberate strategy behind this business transformation. Opium provides extraordinary capital accumulation opportunities, but social opposition to drug commerce will eventually require transition to alternative business activities. We must use current profits to establish legitimate enterprises that will generate long-term wealth independent of opium revenues. The transition strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. Jardine Matheson used opium profits to purchase real estate in Hong Kong, Shanghai, and other treaty ports. This real estate appreciated enormously as these cities developed into major commercial centers. The company then used real estate wealth to finance investments in shipping, manufacturing, and retail businesses that served the growing Asian economy. By 1900, over 70% of Jardine Matheson's revenues came from non-opium sources. Yet the company's entire business empire remained built on the foundation of systematic drug dealing. Modern Jardine Matheson executives prefer not to discuss this historical foundation, but company financial records clearly show the connection between drug dealing and contemporary business success. The Sassoon family presents the most striking example of opium wealth transformation into modern financial power. David Sassoon arrived in Bombay from Baghdad in 1833 and quickly established himself as the primary distributor for East India Company opium. Within 30 years, the Sassoon family had become the wealthiest non-European family in Asia, controlling vast commercial networks that extended from India to China to Britain. Sassoon family wealth at its peak exceeded the entire GDP of most European nations. They owned 47 steamships for opium transportation. They maintained private armies to protect opium shipments. They operated currency exchanges in major Asian cities. They possessed entire city blocks in Bombay, Shanghai, and Hong Kong. But more importantly, the Sassoons systematically converted opium wealth into investments that would generate legitimate profits for future generations. They purchased textile mills in Manchester, banks in London, real estate throughout the British Empire, and government bonds that provided steady income independent of drug dealing. Siegfried Sassoon, the famous World War I poet, was a direct descendant of David Sassoon and inherited wealth that originated from systematic drug dealing. His family's country estate, funded by opium profits, provided the leisure and education that made his literary career possible. Yet few people connect Sassoon's poetry to the drug dealing that financed his family's social position. Modern Sassoon family investments include extensive real estate holdings throughout Asia, significant stakes in international banking, and controlling interests in various manufacturing and shipping companies. The family maintains low public profiles and rarely discusses their business activities, but financial records show continued wealth accumulation that traces directly to opium dealing profits accumulated during the 19th century. Perhaps most disturbing is how opium wealth influenced the development of legitimate British financial institutions that continue to dominate global capitalism. The Bank of England, Lloyd's of London, and various merchant banks provided financial services for opium dealers while maintaining public reputations as respectable institutions serving legitimate commercial activities. These banks profited from opium commerce in multiple ways. They provided credit for opium purchases, handled currency exchanges for international drug transactions, issued insurance policies that protected opium shipments, and managed investment portfolios for merchants who needed to reinvest drug profits in legitimate businesses. Bank of England records from the 1850s show substantial deposits from East India Company merchants and China trade specialists, euphemistic descriptions for opium dealers who couldn't openly acknowledge their business activities. These deposits provided capital that the Bank of England used for financing other commercial activities throughout the British Empire. The insurance market at Lloyd's of London created specific policies for Asia trade vessels that provided coverage against seizure by local authorities in foreign ports. These policies were designed specifically for opium shipments that faced potential confiscation by Chinese officials attempting to enforce anti-drug laws. Edward Lloyd's Coffee House, where this insurance market originated, served as an informal meeting place for merchants involved in Asian commerce, including opium dealers who needed discrete venues for coordinating business activities. The social networks established at Lloyd's created lasting commercial relationships between opium dealers and other British merchants that influenced decades of subsequent business development. Modern Lloyd's of London continues to operate using business practices and institutional relationships that originated during the opium trade period. The market's emphasis on personal relationships, discreet negotiations, and flexible coverage for high-risk activities all reflect approaches developed to serve opium dealers who couldn't openly acknowledge their commercial activities. The transformation of opium wealth into legitimate business investments created economic dynamics that continue to influence global capitalism today. Cities like Hong Kong and Shanghai remain major financial centers because of infrastructure originally developed to support opium commerce. Banking practices developed for handling drug profits became standard procedures for international finance. Commercial networks established for opium distribution evolved into modern multinational corporations. Most significantly, the extraordinary profits generated by systematic drug dealing provided British capitalists with accumulations of wealth that could finance large-scale industrial development during the crucial period of early industrialization. Opium profits helped finance railroad construction, factory development, and technological innovation that gave Britain decisive advantages during the Industrial Revolution. Modern capitalism's emphasis on maximum profit extraction, regardless of social consequences, its willingness to exploit regulatory gaps for competitive advantage, and its assumption that business activities should be protected from government interference, all reflect approaches originally developed to justify systematic drug dealing, disguised as legitimate international commerce. The hidden fortunes built on opium remain embedded within the foundations of modern economic institutions, continuing to generate wealth for descendants of families that accumulated capital through systematic poisoning of Chinese people over 150 years ago. Chapter 10. Generational Trauma. The psychological wounds inflicted by Britain's opium empire extend far beyond historical memory. They created patterns of trauma that continue to shape Chinese behavior, policy decisions, and international relationships 4 generations after the last Opium War ended. Modern psychology recognizes that systematic brutalization of entire populations creates historical trauma, psychological damage that gets transmitted across generations through family stories, cultural practices, and social institutions. Holocaust survivors exhibit this phenomenon, as do Native American communities devastated by European colonization, but nowhere has historical trauma been more extensively documented than in Chinese responses to foreign interference. Dr. Judith Herman, studying trauma psychology at Harvard Medical School, has identified 3 specific characteristics of historical trauma: hypervigilance about potential threats, difficulty trusting foreign institutions, and compulsive need to control environmental conditions that might recreate historical vulnerabilities. Chinese culture exhibits all 3 characteristics in ways that directly connect to Opium War experiences. The hypervigilance appears in Chinese responses to international criticism or pressure. When foreign governments suggest that China should change domestic policies, Chinese officials immediately suspect hidden agendas designed to weaken Chinese sovereignty. This isn't paranoia. It's learned behavior based on historical experience with foreign powers that claimed benevolent intentions while systematically exploiting Chinese vulnerabilities. Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi's response to Western criticism of China's Hong Kong policies revealed this psychological dynamic. Foreign powers once claimed they wanted to civilize China through opium trade. Today they claim they want to democratize China through political interference. The language changes, but the underlying intention remains the same: weakening Chinese sovereignty for foreign benefit. This hypervigilance extends to economic relationships that might create dependencies reminiscent of opium-era vulnerabilities. China's reluctance to accept foreign loans with policy conditions, insistence on technology transfer requirements for foreign investment, and development of indigenous alternatives to foreign products All reflect determination to avoid recreating economic relationships that historically led to political subjugation. The difficulty trusting foreign institutions manifests in Chinese approaches to international law and multilateral cooperation. China participates in international organizations but consistently advocates for strict sovereignty principles that prevent foreign interference in domestic affairs. Chinese officials assume that seemingly reasonable international obligations may be exploited by foreign powers to justify future interference in Chinese affairs, exactly what happened with treaty obligations that legitimized British opium operations. Professor Rana Mitter of Oxford University, studying Chinese historical memory, notes, Chinese leaders approach every international agreement with awareness that Britain used treaty language to establish legal cover for systematic drug dealing. This creates deep skepticism about foreign claims regarding humanitarian intervention, international law, or universal values. This skepticism influences Chinese responses to international human rights criticism, environmental pressure, and trade disputes. Chinese officials consistently interpret foreign pressure as attempts to recreate historical patterns of foreign domination disguised as moral concerns. From a Chinese perspective, foreign powers that once justified drug dealing as free trade now justify political interference as human rights protection. The compulsive need to control environmental conditions appears in Chinese military development, economic planning, and diplomatic strategy. China's military modernization specifically emphasizes capabilities needed to prevent foreign naval forces from controlling Chinese coastal waters, the same geographic control that made British opium policy possible. Admiral Liu Huaqing, architect of China's modern naval strategy, explicitly referenced opium war lessons in his strategic planning documents. China's modern navy must possess sufficient power to ensure that no foreign fleet can again blockade Chinese ports, occupy Chinese territory, or impose unequal treaties on Chinese people. Our naval development priorities must reflect historical experience about foreign naval threats to Chinese sovereignty. China's Belt and Road Initiative represents systematic effort to create international relationships that reverse historical patterns of dependency and exploitation. Instead of foreign powers controlling Chinese infrastructure while extracting Chinese wealth, China invests in foreign infrastructure while expanding Chinese commercial influence. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan noted this historical reversal during the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor inauguration. Britain once used infrastructure control to exploit colonized populations. China uses infrastructure development to strengthen partner capabilities. This represents conscious effort to create international relationships based on mutual benefit rather than systematic extraction. But the most powerful manifestation of generational trauma appears in Chinese popular culture, education, and social values. Chinese students learn about the Opium Wars not as abstract historical events, but as moral lessons about the consequences of national weakness and foreign dependence. Chinese historical textbooks explicitly connect Opium War defeats to contemporary challenges facing China's development. Students learn that technological backwardness, political corruption, and social division enabled foreign exploitation, while national unity, technological advancement, and economic independence provide protection against future foreign interference. This educational approach creates psychological associations between national strength and personal security that influence individual Chinese behavior in ways that extend far beyond politics. Chinese families prioritize education, savings, and property ownership as protection against potential social instability. Chinese businesses emphasize long-term development over short-term profits to avoid vulnerabilities that foreign competitors might exploit. Chinese popular entertainment consistently portrays foreign interference as existential threat, requiring absolute resistance. Movies, television series, novels, and video games regularly feature storylines where Chinese heroes defend China against foreign villains who attempt to weaken China through economic manipulation, political subversion, or cultural infiltration. These entertainment products aren't government propaganda. They're commercial productions that succeed because they resonate with popular emotions shaped by historical trauma. Chinese audiences enthusiastically support stories where Chinese characters successfully resist foreign pressure because these narratives provide psychological satisfaction for historical wounds that never completely healed. The generational transmission occurs through family stories that connect historical events to personal family experiences. Many Chinese families maintain oral traditions about ancestors who suffered during the Opium Wars, foreign occupation, or subsequent periods of social chaos. These family stories create personal connections to historical trauma that influence contemporary attitudes about foreign relations and national security. Zhang Wei, a Beijing University student, explained this psychological connection. "My great-grandfather became addicted to opium and lost our family's land to foreign creditors. My grandfather told me stories about how foreign drugs destroyed our family's prosperity for 3 generations. These aren't abstract historical events. They're family experiences that influence how I think about foreign companies, foreign governments, and foreign culture." Chinese dating and marriage patterns reflect trauma-influenced preferences for partners who demonstrate commitment to Chinese culture and suspicion of foreign influence. Chinese parents often discourage their children from romantic relationships with foreigners, not because of ethnic prejudice, but because of psychological associations between foreign relationships and potential loss of family stability. Even Chinese immigrants who establish successful lives in foreign countries maintain psychological connections to Chinese sovereignty and development that reflect generational trauma transmission. Overseas, Chinese communities consistently support Chinese government policies that demonstrate Chinese strength and independence, even when these policies create diplomatic tensions with their countries of residence. Dr. Amy Lim, studying overseas Chinese psychology at the University of California, observes, Chinese immigrants often exhibit stronger nationalist sentiments than Chinese residents because emigration creates anxiety about cultural identity and national belonging. Supporting Chinese international success provides psychological compensation for physical separation from Chinese society. The trauma manifestations extend to Chinese responses to current global challenges, including climate change, economic inequality, and technological competition. Chinese officials consistently interpret these challenges as potential vulnerabilities that foreign powers might exploit to recreate historical patterns of Chinese subordination. China's approach to climate change negotiations reflects determination to avoid accepting international obligations that might limit Chinese economic development, the same economic development that provides protection against foreign pressure. Chinese officials explicitly argue that climate restrictions imposed by already developed nations represent attempts to prevent Chinese development that might threaten foreign dominance. Similarly, Chinese responses to technology transfer demands, trade dispute negotiations, and financial cooperation proposals all reflect psychological assumptions that foreign powers seek Chinese subordination disguised as mutually beneficial cooperation. The generational trauma created by Britain's opium empire continues to influence Chinese behavior, 180 years after the First Opium War began. Understanding this psychological legacy is essential for comprehending why Chinese responses to foreign pressure often seem disproportionate to outside observers who don't appreciate the historical context that shapes Chinese perceptions of foreign intentions. The Opium Wars created wounds that will influence Chinese culture, until China achieves sufficient strength and international respect to heal the psychological damage created by systematic foreign exploitation of Chinese vulnerabilities during the 19th and early 20th centuries. When you step back and examine the full scope of Britain's opium empire, you're looking at something unprecedented in human history, a democratic government that spent over a century systematically poisoning foreign populations to generate tax revenue while claiming moral authority to civilize backward peoples. The scale defies comprehension. Between 1757 and 1949, British-controlled opium operations created an estimated 100 million addicts across Asia, generated over $500 billion in modern currency, and destroyed social institutions that had maintained stability for thousands of years. The Sassoon family alone accumulated more wealth than most European nations possessed. HSBC built a banking empire, on laundered drug money that continues to dominate global finance today. Yet somehow, this remains the untold story of how modern capitalism was born. Every major British institution has opium money in its foundation. The genteel country estates where British aristocrats developed their refined cultural traditions were purchased with profits from systematic drug dealing. The universities where British intellectuals developed theories about free trade and human progress were funded by donations from merchants who specialized in creating addiction. The museums where British cultural achievements are displayed were built using wealth extracted through psychological warfare disguised as commercial activity. The moral implications are staggering. British merchants weren't accidentally creating social problems. They were deliberately weaponizing addiction to achieve economic and political objectives. British officials weren't defending legitimate commercial rights. They were protecting criminal enterprises that generated enormous profits for British shareholders while devastating foreign populations. Most disturbing is how British society convinced itself this was morally acceptable. Parliamentary debates from the 1840s reveal British politicians arguing that opium sales promoted free trade principles, commercial liberty, and mutual economic benefit between Britain and China. The same politicians who would express moral outrage about slavery simultaneously defended systematic drug dealing as legitimate business activity. This wasn't hypocrisy. It was something worse. It was systematic moral blindness that allowed British society to justify literally anything that generated profits for British interests while maintaining self-image as a civilized, Christian, progressive nation. The precedent established by Britain's opium empire shaped everything that followed in global relations. European colonialism, American economic imperialism, corporate globalization, they all used Britain's opium model, claim moral authority while systematically exploiting foreign vulnerabilities, justify extraction as mutual benefit, and use military force against anyone who attempts to protect their population from systematic exploitation. Modern drug cartels follow the same operational patterns that Britain established in China. Systematic corruption of local officials, military protection for commercial operations, financial institutions that launder drug profits, and political influence that prevents effective law enforcement. The only difference is scale and legal protection. Pablo Escobar's organization generated roughly $30 billion annually at its peak. Britain's opium empire generated $47 billion annually in modern currency, while operating with complete legal immunity and military protection provided by the Royal Navy. Escobar faced international law enforcement pressure and was ultimately killed by his own government. British opium merchants received knighthoods and had warships named in their honor. The psychological impact on Chinese civilization created trauma that continues to influence international relations today. Chinese hypervigilance about foreign interference, skepticism about international law, and determination to achieve complete sovereignty all reflect learned responses to historical experience with foreign powers that claimed benevolent intentions while systematically exploiting Chinese vulnerabilities. China's current international behavior becomes completely comprehensible when understood as systematic effort to ensure that no foreign power will ever again possess the capability to impose opium war-style humiliation on Chinese people. Chinese military development, economic policy, and diplomatic strategy all prioritize preventing recreation of historical vulnerabilities that made foreign exploitation possible. Yet the lessons extend beyond China to every developing nation that faces pressure to accept international economic arrangements that might create dependencies on foreign powers. The Opium Wars demonstrated that economic dependency inevitably becomes political submission when foreign powers possess sufficient military capability to enforce compliance with economic arrangements that benefit foreign interests at local expense. This is why economic sovereignty remains such a sensitive issue throughout Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Developing nations understand that accepting foreign control over domestic economic policy recreates the same vulnerabilities that made Opium War defeats possible. Foreign investment, international loans, and trade agreements all require careful evaluation to ensure they strengthen rather than weaken national capabilities. The most tragic aspect of Britain's opium empire is how completely it succeeded in its ultimate objective, demonstrating that systematic exploitation could be disguised as humanitarian assistance, economic cooperation, and civilizing mission. This deception created psychological conditions for accepting foreign domination as natural rather than criminal. Modern international relations continue to reflect patterns established by British opium policy. Powerful nations continue to justify economic pressure against weaker nations as promoting democracy, human rights, and international law. International institutions continue to impose policy conditions on developing nations that serve the interests of already developed nations while claiming to promote mutual benefit and global prosperity. Whether these modern patterns represent continuation of historical exploitation or genuine evolution toward more equitable international relationships depends on outcomes that haven't yet been determined. The same institutions that once laundered opium profits now claim to promote sustainable development. The same political theories that once justified systematic drug dealing now claim to promote universal human welfare. The ultimate test will be whether modern international economic relationships actually strengthen developing nations' capabilities to protect their population's welfare and maintain political independence, or whether they recreate dependency relationships that allow foreign powers to influence domestic policy decisions in ways that serve foreign rather than local interests. Britain's opium empire revealed something fundamental about power relationships that remains relevant today. Any relationship between unequal powers will be